Hi everyone. So for today, we will be discussing about cellular respiration. So here are the different topics that we will be tackling for this chapter. So it includes cells use energy in food to make ATP. Cellular respiration includes three main processes. In eukaryotic cells, mitochondria produce most ATP. Glycolysis breaks down glucose to pyruvate. Aerobic respiration yields much more ATP than glycolysis alone. How many ATPs can one glucose molecule yield? Other food molecules enter the energy extracting pathways, and fermentation generates ATP only in glycolysis. So these are the main ideas per subtopics. And at the end of this lesson, hopefully, you guys will be able to functionally define cellular respiration, identify the reactants and products of cellular respiration, differentiate the major chemical events of cellular respiration, and finally, summarize in the form of illustration or diagram the process of cellular respiration. So our need for oxygen is absolute. We lose consciousness after just a few minutes without it, and we can extract it only from air, which explains why swimmers must emerge to breathe every few moments and why scuba divers carry tanks filled with compressed air. Life also demands a steady supply of food. We know from our previous lesson, photosynthesis, that plants make their own food, but us, animals, have to eat. And there is an intimate relationship between our twin requirement to eat and breathe. Both are essential for the production of ATP, the power-packed molecule that supplies energy for life's activities. Now, this chapter will describe how cells make those little ATP molecules that nothing can live without. Okay, so no cell can survive without ATP or adenosine triphosphate. Without this energy toting molecule, or without this energy currency, you could not have developed from a fertilized egg into an adult. You cannot breathe, chew, talk, circulate your blood, walk, or even listen to music. And without ATP, a plant could not grow. A fungus could not produce mushrooms. A bacterial cell could not divide or move. Like a car without gasoline, a cell without ATP would simply die. Now, ATP is essential because it powers nearly every activity that requires energy in the cell. Say, for example, the synthesis of DNA, RNA, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Active transport membranes or active transport across membranes, separation of duplicated chromosomes during cell division, muscle contractions, and many others. This constant need for ATP explains the need for for a steady food supply. All organisms, from trees to whales to bacteria, use the potential energy stored in food to make ATP. Now the question is, where does the food come from in the first place? So if you can still remember our previous lesson about photosynthesis, that actually explains the answer. Now, in most ecosystems, plants and other autotrophs use photosynthesis to make organic molecules such as glucose out of carbon dioxide and water. Light supplies the energy. The carbohydrates produced in photosynthesis not only feed autotrophs, but also all of the animals, fungi, and microbes that share the ecosystem. So all cells need ATP, but they don't all produce in the same way. In aerobic respiration, a cell uses oxygen gas and glucose to generate ATP. Plants, animals, and most microbes, especially those in oxygen-rich environments, use aerobic respiration. Other pathways, including fermentation, generate ATP from glucose without using oxygen. Now, the overall equation for aerobic respiration is essentially just the reverse of photosynthesis, as you can see here. So the general equation for aerobic respiration would be glucose plus oxygen yielding carbon dioxide, water, and also energy. Now this equation reveals that aerobic cellular respiration requires organisms to acquire oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, as you can see in the picture. In humans and many other animals, the circulatory system carries inhaled oxygen to cells. Now, oxygen diffuses into the cell's mitochondria, which is the site of respiration. So the picture that you see here is how we picture out the cellular respiration happening in the mitochondria. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cells and into the bloodstream to be healed or to be exhaled by the lungs. Now, many people mistakenly believe that plants do not use cellular respiration because they are photosynthetic. In fact, plants use oxygen to respire about half of the glucose they produce. Now, the question is, why do plants have a reputation for producing oxygen if they also consume it? The reason is that plants incorporate much of the remaining glucose into cellulose, starch, and other stored organic molecules. Therefore, they absorb much more carbon dioxide in photosynthesis than they release in respiration, and they release much more oxygen than they consume. So for the rest of this chapter, we will be describing how cells use the potential energy in food to generate ATP. Like in photosynthesis, the journey entails several overlapping metabolic pathways and many different chemicals. But if we consider energy release in major stages, the logic emerges. Which leads us to the second topic for this lesson, which is cellular respiration includes three main processes. The chemical reaction that generates ATP is pretty much straightforward. An enzyme tacks a phosphate group onto ADP or adenosine diphosphate, yielding ATP or adenosine triphosphate. As described in the previous chapter, however, ATP synthesis requires an input of energy. The metabolic pathways of respiration harvest potential energy from food molecules and use it to make ATP. So this section will just briefly explain to you the overview of these different processes, but the detailed ways or processes will be discussed during the synchronous session. So the image that you see here actually is the overview of aerobic cellular respiration. So a 6-carbon glucose is broken down into 6 molecules of carbon dioxide in 3 main stages, which are glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. Along the way, energy is harvested as ATP. Except for glycolysis, these reactions occur inside the mitochondria of eukaryotic cells. So like photosynthesis, respiration is an oxidation-reduction reaction. The pathways of aerobic respiration oxidize or remove electrons from glucose and reduce or add electrons to oxygen. Because of oxygen's strong attraction for electrons, this reaction is easy, like riding a bike downhill. It therefore releases energy which the cell traps in the bonds of ATP. Now, this reaction does not happen all at once. If a cell released all the potential energy in glucose chemical bonds in one uncontrolled step, the sudden release of heat would destroy the cell. In effect, it would act like a tiny bomb. Rather, the chemical bonds and atoms in glucose are rearranged one step at a time, releasing a tiny bit of energy with each transformation. Some of this energy is released as heat, but much of it is stored in the chemical bonds of ATP. Now, biologists organize the intricate biochemical pathways of respiration into 3 main groups, which are, as you can see here, glycolysis. We also have Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Now, in glycolysis, which literally means breaking sugar, a 6-carbon molecule, which is glucose, splits into 3 carbon molecules of pyruvate, or in some references you will see pyruvic acid. That's the same. Pyruvic acid and pyruvate are the same. This process harvests energy in two forms. First, some of the electrons from glucose are transferred to an electron carrier molecule called NADH. Second, glycolysis generates 2 molecules of ATP. Additional reactions, including a transition step and the Krebs cycle, oxidize the pyruvate and release carbon dioxide. Enzymes rearrange atoms and bonds in ways that transfer the pyruvate's potential energy and electrons to ATP, to NADH, and another electron carrier molecule, FADH2. So if you're going to be looking at the image here, you might notice that there is no ATP, but what you have instead actually would be GTP. So instead of having ATP, the Krebs cycle's energy currency would be GTP, which is the energy carrying molecule equivalent to ATP. So that's pretty much they pretty much works the same way. Next, we have the electron transport chain. Now, by the time Krebs cycle is complete, the carbon atoms that make up the glucose are gone, and they are liberated as carbon dioxide. The cell has generated a few molecules of ATP, but most of the potential energy from glucose now lingers in the high-energy electron carriers, which are NADH and FADH2. The cell uses them to generate more ATP. The electron transport chain transfers energy-rich electrons from NADH and FADH2 through a series of membrane proteins. As electrons pass from carrier to carrier in the electron transport chain, the energy is used to create a gradient of hydrogen ions. The mitochondrion uses the potential energy stored in this proton gradient to generate ATP. Now, an enzyme called ATP synthase forms a channel in the membrane, releasing the protons and using their potential energy to add phosphate to ADP. In the meantime, the spent electrons are transferred to oxygen, generating water as a waste product.